Okay. The Jurassic Park part of this, just to warn you, is very limited. There's a lot of pictures of dinosaurs. There's no information about them. So I'm going to go with a few little disclaimers. Once you've read the important one there, if you get eaten by a dinosaur during this presentation, that is not my responsibility. We will consider giving you gift vouchers for the gift shop or the cafeteria. The connection to Jurassic Park is loose at best and is mostly related to pictures of dinosaurs. So do not expect this time, I'll talk to Nicholas about another time, do not expect this time anything about a risk assessment of the InGen Jurassic Park franchise and how they could have done better. There may be an ISO 27K gap assessment coming out at some point, but we'll talk about that when it does. Secondly, while I have an unfortunate habit of stating everything as unquestionable fact, once or twice people have been known to disagree. On rarer occasions, they've even been correct. So throughout this, I'm presenting a very particular view of policy and risk frameworks, which you could, if you were being generous, call the textbook version, tempered by many, many years of frustration. So if you disagree, that's fine. Shout out, question, argue, whatever. I'm happy to get into those discussions. There we go, my clicker worked. So starting off, and this may not seem related to risk governance right now, but every company has a mission statement. It might not be explicit. It might not be documented. In fact, in many cases, it's not. But there is no company which exists for no purpose. Even if we start looking at shell companies, they have an implicit mission statement, which might be to shelter their ultimate beneficiary owners from tax investigations. But there is a mission statement there. While you can begin building up a policy and governance framework without a mission statement, it's a really bad idea. Don't do that. If you don't have the mission statement, do not start building it up. Many companies don't really understand this and expect it to be, I'm sorry, not a paleontology talk. I'll try that for next time. Many companies don't understand effective governance internally, and they will still plow on and exist without considering why they exist. Your average mission statement is somewhere between a sentence and a paragraph. So this is a nice short one. For those of you who know Jurassic Park, InGen was the company who set it up, and I'd argue this was kind of their mission statement. Provide customers with a wild experience through cutting-edge archaeogenetic research, which I did discover is a real word and a real discipline. So that was fun. But if you are going into a company, whether it's as an interview or anything else, just a small piece of career advice. If in an interview you get to ask an interviewer why their company exists, and they say it exists to make money, run away really fast. It's a sign they have no idea what their company exists for. No company actually exists to make money, or at least not one worth working for. Right. Anyway, this is all about policy, framework, governance, and various other bits and pieces. So, hopefully I can make that. There we go. We have the pyramid, the policy pyramid. So from that, we have policies. Policies are the second highest level, once you've defined your mission statement as an organization, and this is very governance focused, so it's very top down, but you have defined your policy. This is your highest level statement of management intent. In the UK, we might say directorial because there's particular legal bits and pieces around that. It's what the company is aiming to achieve at one level down from the mission statement. Now we go one level down from that, and we have control objectives. You will sometimes hear these called objectives, and sometimes they may not exist at all. But the point of control objectives is every single one of them should relate straight back to the policy. So if you ask someone, what's the aim of this objective? And they can't answer you, well, it's to fulfill this policy, there's a problem. So control objectives are what we're trying to achieve with controls. And controls, you will hear both controls and standards. They're pretty much interchangeable terms. They are the requirements that you put in place to meet those objectives. The important thing when we start talking about controls and standards and control objectives, they must be measurable. You have to be able to report them in some way. If you cannot measure it, you are not in control. You have no idea what you're doing. So if you don't have a way to assess it, then you aren't in control. It's not useful. Sometimes you will find guidelines in companies between this and the next step. Now, with guidelines, they are optional controls that can be applied. And just a word of advice, if you get guidelines, no one ever follows them. It's not really worth documenting them. Just document your controls. Your controls are mandatory. You do not get a choice about applying them. And at this point, we are talking about documentation. So we have policy. Policy is about strategic aims of the organization. Control objectives are about how we break those down and meet those particular objectives. And controls and standards are how we meet the control objectives, how we meet those broken down objectives. Guidelines are pointless, so we'll ignore them for now. We then have processes. Process is a kind of meta level. So a process is a collection of other things together, and you can lump them all together into a process, and we'll go straight onto that. So processes are a collection of procedures. Now, procedures get very disciplined, very detailed. Procedures are what work, step by step, do I need to do for this part of the process. The process is how do I meet this particular control. The control is what am I trying to do. And the control objective is about how I'm measuring it. The policy is about why. Why on earth am I doing this in the first place? And then we've got the biggest piece, which is missed out in a surprising number of organizations. We've got the actual work. So you can do all of this documentation and you can pass an audit with the documentation, but unless someone is doing the actual work to implement those procedures, to carry out that process, to meet that control, to meet that objective, and that objective is in service of a policy, it's kind of pointless, and you will find a lot of organizations have trouble with this. They instead will start from the top of the pyramid and try to work down, and you cannot build a pyramid from the top. So if you're putting actual work in and no one can answer the why, there are some problems. Let's start from the bottom of that, the policy. We've already got the mission statement. We know why the company exists. With policies, and this is where I'm getting into I am speaking from a point of absolute biblical truth, where I could be wrong and people could argue with me, but I am going to speak from that anyway. So feel free to argue. There are certain rules for policies which are non-negotiable within an organization if you actually want to apply a governance framework. The first one of those is that policies must be documented. If it's not documented, if it's not written down, it isn't a policy. You cannot have implicit policies in larger organizations. In micro businesses, okay, all of those policies can be in the founder's head. But the moment you've gone beyond one person, you need to have that written down. You need to have it clearly stated. If it isn't written down somewhere, it isn't a policy. The second rule is policies must be owned and they must be controlled. So like dinosaurs, and here we get back to Jurassic Park, like dinosaurs, if you don't keep them under control, then things go off the rails. Thanks, Phil. Ownership, we will get to. And ownership is important, but we're just going through the hierarchy now. So the important thing to remember is that an owner is an individual person. Now, that could be a particular individual role, that could be a particular job title, but it has to be an individual person. Next, policies are short. You will find a ridiculous number of organizations who have 50-page policies. Okay, ridiculous at this point means greater than one, but you will find that. But policies are meant to be short. They are the strategic aims that you are going for as an organization. I would always argue if a policy is more than 2 pages in length, if we ignore all of the document control pages, which are often longer, if it's more than 2 pages in length, it's too long. You need to clarify it. You need to rethink it. Short, simple, and direct are key. Rule 4, policies are mandatory. Within an organization, you cannot say you should do something as part of policy. This is where there might be arguments. If the word should appears in a policy, you should shred it and start over. That's not to say that policies can never be questioned, changed, or reviewed, but really the words you want for them are shall, will, and must. Policies are very authoritarian. They are very dictatorial. They relate directly back to the strategic aims of a company. There is no room to work around them, because if you do, you are going outside of the world of the project, my system, my particular activity should have a policy exception. There are no policy exceptions. If it's something that goes against the policy, it is a breach. It is not an exception, it is a breach. And that means there must be a plan to take corrective action against it. It doesn't mean that when we get down to the detail in a moment with the mammoths, you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. It doesn't mean you cannot have exceptions, but you cannot have things which are accepted from the policy. They are important. They are mandatory. You cannot work around them. You can change them, but you cannot work around them. Then we get into controls and objectives, sometimes called control objectives from people who like more words than I do. But we have objectives. Now, objectives are something that descend from policies. Often, if you're in an organization, these will be documented together. And there really isn't a problem with that. They are very tightly tied together. The main reason you might want to separate them is if you want multiple controls to meet a single objective. Or, alternatively, if you are using a documentation system slightly more sophisticated than your average 4-ring binder. There are ways to tie these together with anything electronic nowadays, but we've got a lot of legacy stuff. Multiple controls can meet a single objective, but the objective has to be defined. A single control can meet a single objective, and that's fine as well. But if a control does not have an objective, it is utterly pointless. Objectives come first. And a key part here is that objectives must, and I do mean must, be measurable. If you cannot measure how a control meets an objective, it is a bad control. You have something wrong somewhere. So you cannot start applying controls without knowing what you are trying to achieve. And that has to directly tie back to the policy. And the policy in most organizations should tie back to that mission statement. My favorite or most hated example of this is how password standards, password controls are horrendously misused. So you will hear organizations say, well, we have this particular password standard because it's best practice. Best practice is not a useful answer. If it meets the requirements of that organization, if they need a 2-character password chosen from just alphabetical characters to meet their objectives, that's fine. That is the objective. If you cannot answer the why of why you're implementing a control, there is something wrong. Best practice is not an answer on its own. It has to have that context. So, going a bit further up the pyramid, we then have process, procedure, and work. And I've linked these together for a reason. Processes can contain procedures. If a process is a single procedure, don't bother documenting the process. If a process is multiple procedures, that's fine. Just link them all together for that process and say, this procedure is step 1, this one is step 2, that's fine. So process, procedure, it gets iffy depending on the scale of your organization. The bit that is important here, and the bit that surprisingly often gets missed, is that the work is done. So you will come across organizations where the policy is documented, the controls are documented, the objectives of the controls are documented, the process is documented. There are multi-page procedures on how to achieve that, and yet no one actually does the real work to meet those. And if you deal with a good auditor, they will pick up on that and they will start screaming that you're not doing what you're meant to do. So, while most hierarchies will say, well, we've got policies, we've got our objectives, we've got our controls, we have our process, we have our procedure. If you have a good auditor, they will say, okay, prove you're doing the work. And that ties back to the objectives. Is it being met? Is it measurable? It really is not enough to say, we have everything documented, but we're not doing anything. Now, I promised risk in the original title, so I can hear you all thinking, hopefully. My psychic powers are kicking in. Excellent information, brilliant dinosaur pictures, but I wanted to hear about risk management, not all of this documentation stuff. Some of you are probably saying I'm wrong there, but I'm reading some of your thoughts, it's fine. That was all laying the information or laying the foundation for the rest of it. So let's segue into what is risk. Now, depending on who you ask, you will hear lots of different definitions of risk. I have multiple of them myself. Some of them are very long and ridiculously complex, and some are overly reductive. If this was a threat modeling session, I would be talking about risk as being a combination of a threat, which is something outside of your control, a vulnerability, a weakness inside your control, and an impact to an asset. This isn't a threat modeling session. That is a really useful definition when you are looking at threat modeling and we are going more technical. But if we're talking about governance, we are operating at a different level from that. So my preferred one, if we're talking about risk at the governance level, I tend to steal my definition of risk from the financial management world because they've been doing it a lot longer than we have. In finance, risk is the uncertainty between expected or planned results and the actual results. So if we want to put proper risk management in place, we really need to know two things. Firstly, how do we measure the uncertainty? And secondly, how do we manage or control that uncertainty? Now, the good news is, back when we had the woolly mammoths, we answered this. Measurement of uncertainty is about our control objectives. It goes up to that level of the organization. I don't care whether it's quantitative, qualitative, some weird hybrid. I partly care if it's some weird, awful, should be put down 4x4 box model. It could be something genuinely useful, but the important thing is that our measurement of risk is how do our controls meet those objectives and what is the uncertainty between those two. The control of those risks, really easy. It's the controls. We have controls to meet particular objectives, and we manage risk by keeping it within those control objectives. We manage uncertainty by keeping it within what we're aiming to do. Now, there's something really key missing here, because that's all well and good in a nice abstract way. Well, we're trying to meet the control objectives and we use controls to do that, and we measure the difference between the two and bring it down. How do we actually define what those control objectives are? Well, that goes back to the mission statement. That goes back to why does this organization exist? We have some idea how to measure risk. There's all sorts of systems out there to measure it. We have some idea how to control it. And we know how our policy framework relates to it. But there's a key part here which needs to be defined between those two. And disturbingly enough, I have found it defined very, very few times. We need to know, in the context of the organization's mission statement and the strategic threats that may exist to that mission, and the resources available to that organization, how much risk is acceptable. Now, good news, we can go back to the dinosaurs here, because the shorthand term for this is risk appetite. If we are a tiny velociraptor with very small resources, very simple aims, our risk appetite might be quite small. We can't swallow that much of it. If we're a Tyrannosaurus, it might be larger. Equally, that might not be true. If we are that little velociraptor, then we might have huge appetite because there's a dozen other ones running around out there. And if we're a Tyrannosaurus, well, we're kind of heading up the pack, and if the market collapses below us, there's huge problems. Risk appetite is all about the context of the organization. And ideally, it is re-evaluated on a regular basis. There will be cases where particular things fall outside of our understood risk appetite and are acceptable to the company due to the potential benefits. Are we okay to potentially lose half our income for the potential benefit of opening up 4 new markets? There's going to be the flip side as well, where are we okay to risk 1/100th of our income when, if that's received badly by the market, it could really hurt? So it all comes down to risk appetite and risk assessment and an understanding of how we manage it. The rest of it is all about documentation around it, and documentation of controls, documentation about what our aims are as an organization, and documentation of how we're actually going to do that. I'm sorry to those of you who are expecting more dinosaurs. We're now on a saber-toothed tiger. But from that, are there questions, or do you want me to start digging into Jurassic Park and how they failed utterly at risk management and control? I have no idea on RFC 2119. I'm trying to remember which one avian carrier is. Right. Yes. This is an opinion. People will disagree. In my view, policy is mandatory. And policy is must, shall, will. There is no option. There is no should. If it's should, that's a guideline, and that's kind of pointless because no one's going to follow it if it raises an obstacle for them. So policy is absolute. It really is. I know that sounds very almost religious and dogmatic. Oh, thank you. 1149. Yeah, policy is an absolute. It is you will do this if you are part of this organization. That is an opinion. People might disagree. They shouldn't, just to throw in a fluffy word there, but policy defines what an organization does. Yeah, the important thing with RFCs is all about RFCs are written for engineers. Engineers like to flex boundaries. And the problem with that is it leaves wiggle room so people will do the minimum work. If you are running an organization, there is no room for that. You shall, you will, or you must. If you say should, no one's going to do it. really, just no one's going to bother doing it in the first place. Yeah, policy is very authoritarian and dictatorial. It's in a way kind of difficult that way. I need to work out. There we go. Kind of dictatorial, but organizations are there to organize humans. We're not talking anything particularly complex. Sorry, I will be back in one moment. Yeah, I think my biggest problem with RFCs is the abbreviation is there to say request for comment. It was never designed to meet particular strategic aims. There is nothing to say why are we doing this. Yeah, that's because there's nothing interesting on the screen. If anyone wants to see the mammoths, I can share the mammoths again. I like the mammoths. There we go. We have mammoths. Um, one of the problems that we have in InfoSec, because I'm going on to random rambling now, is that a lot of us are engineers. And engineers are good at achieving particular objectives. But when we start looking at RFCs, there is no objective there that they're all trying to work towards. There is nothing strategic over it. It's engineering for the sake of engineering. It's actually, that's an interesting question. Is there anything that sits over RFCs to say, why on earth are we putting this work into creating these documents? Yeah. And this is why we have things like the OSI model, which, by the way, is wrong. It's just these things exist, and this is where organizations get it wrong, because they just say this is best practice, this is what's dictated, and don't stop to ask, why on earth are we doing this? Password policy is a perfect example. I have had more than enough arguments over the years about why your password policy should not involve changing your password every 30 days, because that's best practice. But why are you doing it? Well, you're doing it because decades ago, you could assume that passwords were compromised every 30 days. Nowadays, not so much. You'd be better off instead saying have a single password and make it longer than 16 characters.
Yeah, my uni forces us to change passwords every 6 months. It's
Yeah.
annoying considering my password is 64 characters long and I have a 2FA. thing afterwards. I think they could let me off the hook, but you know.
Yeah, I'm just disappointed they don't make multi-passes anymore, and my one broke, so I can't just rely on that anymore. So all of my passwords are at least 16 characters long, but still have to change them every 30 days for some clients.
There was this one policy. It's in the AWS terms of service. If you read through the terms of service, which I've done for absolutely no reason, there is an entire section that is a meme. I'm not even joking. There is an entire chapter that's basically a massive meme. Let me just find it again. Something about lumber.
Doesn't surprise me for a moment. I mean, this is why, if your policy is longer than 2 pages, you have done something wrong. Really fundamentally wrong.
I found it. It's chapter 42 about the Amazon lumberyard engine. There is also mention of, I think, zombies in this chapter.
It is the same idea with policies. If you're writing policies for an organization and you go over 2 pages, no one's going to read them.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the strategic aims of your organization. These are the things set by the highest level of management. If everyone else isn't reading them, you have a problem. Career advice: you walk into an organization, you go to an interview, and you say, well, why is your company in business? If they say to make money, walk away, because it means they don't understand why they exist as an organization. Money is nice, but money is a means to an end. It's not an aim in and of itself. And this is probably getting political.
I found the part about these zombies.
Yeah.
42.10. However, this restriction will not apply in the event of the occurrence of widespread viral infection transmitted via bites or contacts with bodily fluids that cause human corpses to reanimate and seek to consume living human flesh, blood, brain, or nerve tissue, and is likely to result in the fall of organized civilization. This is in the AWS terms of service, by the way. I'm not even joking.
And some engineer helping to write that thought it was really funny.
I have to agree, but still.
I kind of agree it's funny, but what use is it to anyone?
Probably none.
Your policy should be the minimum of organization. There's a saying, if I had longer, I would have written a shorter document. And the terms of service are a contract.
Yeah.
These are terms you are legally agreeing to.
I just love the idea of, having a legal document that you're somewhat signing to by just pressing I agree and not reading it, of course, that just states something about the undead. And, this has been there for at least a year.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole part here about threat modeling and realistic threats. Is that a genuine risk that AWS need to worry about? If it is it one they could do anything about? I think you've been on one of my threat modeling courses.
Oh, yeah.
Alien invasion is something you could prepare for and write into your contracts, but what's the point? You don't want to make people do more work than they need to. No, I suspect they had not an intern, but a highly paid lawyer or engineer do that because it was funny. And I like humor. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of humor. But this is a document that they are saying everyone reads and everyone signs up to as a contract. Terms of service, it is a legal document that you're signing up to. There's problems here. Something's gone wrong.
It's probably been there longer than a year, but I think Gerard, who's not here with us currently, talked to us about it 6, 7, 8 months ago. And we're like, oh shit, it's true.
I can't remember who it was. There was one company which put a prize in their terms of service,
Oh yeah, right.
and it took over a year for someone to win it, which they took as, oh well, no one reads the terms of service. And honestly, if you're running an organisation and no one reads the contract they're signing up to, under UK law, that contract is invalid. You can't just say, oh well, no one read it and therefore it applies.
The com-
There's fundamental problems there.
the company was what is it, PC Pit Stop or something? Um, I have the name here.
Mm.
PC Matic, antivirus and ransom protection.
Yeah, you have not won by saying, well, no one read the contract that they signed up to. You have lost at that point.
Someone else found what was it, $10,000 reward.
Mhm.
Squaremouth, a Florida insurance company, had inserted language promising a reward to the first person who emailed the company. Took them,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is not a success.
Mm-hmm. 2017, 22,000 people who signed up for free public Wi-Fi and inadvertently agreed to 1,000 hours of community service. Like, okay.
Mhm.
So,
UK law, not legally binding because the contract was too dense and therefore no one would read it.
mhm.
If no one reads a contract before signing it and it's reasonable expectation of reading it, you've got a problem.
There was a checkbox on a London Wi-Fi access thing where you had to check the box to give away your oldest child in exchange for Wi-Fi access. The box just was assign their firstborn child to us for the duration of eternity.
Yeah.
And 6 people just signed up still.
There's an argument that this stuff is funny, but there's a really disturbing argument that someone wrote this
Yes.
and relied on the fact that the contract was unenforceable.
Hmm.
Um, Going back to the policy, if it's over 2 pages, no one's going to read it. Your policy, I'd argue 1 page is too much, but over 2 pages, you've got a problem. Now, process and procedures, fine. You can make those detailed because people will be following it step by step to do the work. But yeah, it's really disturbing when contracts get that detailed and they rely on people not reading it and present that as a triumph.
Definitely.
It's okay. We have mammoths. It's fine. Next time I'll do a full risk assessment of Jurassic Park. They did really badly.
Ooh, yes. Sign me up.